Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 63rd episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to be back with you all, and in a weird, shocking turn of events, we're actually recording this before the previous episode is even released. What? Due to plans and schedules and things happening, what we would normally be doing towards the end of a particular month, in this case May, we're actually doing it at the beginning of May, so this is well in advance of a lot of things, but that's because we're all doing stuff one way or another. I'm out on a vacation to the East Coast, Jared's got some plans coming back. There's Memorial Day weekend, and we all just sort of looked at each other and went like, let's, yeah. so we're sort of rushing into this one, but it's a topic that, we agreed we definitely have done quite a few things on and all the rest of it. So, but yes, even though it will have been almost a month by the time you've heard this episode, I will have a chance to see Oriana for the first time since Portland last year when we did the live thing. Yeah.
I guess that's not even that long ago.
Yeah.
It was like a little over a year.
A little over a year, yeah. So, hey, things like that. So, we'll, having done our confabs and things over here, I mean, now that I think about it, meeting you was kind of the first step that happened back in 2019 when I was out in New York like 5 years ago. So, shortly after things, we met at that, we got a bagel at the local spot near the hotel I was at. So,
yeah.
Oh, ancient times.
It was so ancient before the world changed.
It really was, yeah. It's like I keep forgetting, we started this thing in 2019. Crazy. And it all went south from there. So anyway, let's see. A reminder once again that our certain co-host here has a book coming out in a couple of months. We will keep pumping it up. West Passage. Come on, guys. So we have faith in you all, and even if you pre-order it, that you'll go look for it. So ask your library to pre-order it. There you go. Yeah, put it on hold at your local library. These are important steps. There are things like that. So, okay. Well, here is a general question for you. Just one. Have they figured out who's doing the audio version yet?
Yes, I don't know if I'm allowed to say.
Got it. Okay.
Because we just made a decision a couple days ago. So yeah, but I'm excited.
Cool.
It was extremely surreal. I got to listen to the auditions, and it was so weird hearing people read. I was like, oh God, somebody else knows these words.
And has really
weird.
Internalized them.
Yeah,
I'm sure from the sound of it.
Yeah, because it was like writing it was so much of an interior monologue kind of thing.
Mm.
Like, this is just extremely personal in a bizarre way. So having somebody else read it to me was just, several somebodies. It was like, I don't know how to process this. It's weird, and I don't know if I'll ever get used to it.
Wow, and it was all the same passage, I take it, so you could compare.
It was, and this is...
Was it the West Passage?
Oh, jeez.
Technically, it was in the part of the... Anyway, they picked... I don't know if I should say this, but I'm going to. They picked a part that I'm still not really happy with to audition with. So hearing over and over this passage that I'm just like, I'm not happy with it, to hear it as the audition thing over and over and over.
No.
Well, you see, think of it this way. If whoever was the best at doing this with the thing you're not happy with, surely that means everything else would be really fantastic. So you see?
Yeah.
Reverse psychology. So
right. And I did express this to my agent, and she was like, I thought it was great. So I was like, okay, well, maybe it's just me. It's not. And nobody will ever know. Nobody will know what passage I'm talking about.
There you go. Yeah, right. So everyone wins, we hope, in the end.
Yeah.
So,
I'm gonna wheedle that shit out of you, Jared.
Long-term planning.
I'll tell you off mic.
Put my journalist hat on and just ply you with
Look, I will tell
cordials.
you off mic. It's fine.
Oh, okay.
We'll leave it at that. So, well, since but as we are still on mic, we should get going. There is some news, a mix of it. We wish it was all good, but it isn't. So, anyway, at this point, Jared, please take it away.
Yeah, mixed bag this time. A couple of things related to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy to share out. And again, we're recording this in early May, so any further news from the rest of this month, as well as June, we'll have to wait until our July episode. On June 8th to the 10th, the trilogy is returning to the theaters throughout the U.S. as a special one-off event, one movie each day. It's always nice to see the films on a big screen again, but please keep in mind, while these are the extended versions of each film, they are also the theatrical debut of the 4K remastering done a couple of years back that, among other things, completely reworked the original color gradings. We are not fans of that, as you may know from prior episodes. But that said, given this is being done 6 months in advance of the War of the Rohirrim, it's very likely that we might see an initial trailer or behind-the-scenes clip of work on that film included as a bonus with the screenings. But there might be another reason to catch the screenings. On a much sadder note, news broke the morning of recording that veteran UK actor Bernard Hill had passed away suddenly at the age of 79. While an acting legend in the UK since his powerful work in the 1980s realist drama TV series Boys from the Black Stuff and later appearing in Peter Greenaway's Drowning by Numbers, he achieved worldwide renown as Captain Smith in James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic, among many other roles up to the present day, including a striking performance as the Duke of Norfolk in the BBC adaptation of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. But it was, of course, his textured, grounded, and extremely human performance as Theoden in Jackson's trilogy that cemented his fame. As we've talked about in our episodes on the trilogy, his work in The Two Towers and The Return of the King in particular, his many scenes with Miranda Otto's Eowyn are absolute standouts, and no question he'll be greatly missed.
Yeah, just a real shame because it was so sudden. In fact, it was so sudden that he was scheduled to appear at a Comic-Con being held in Liverpool with a whole bunch of the other Lord of the Rings cast members who were there. So all four of the Hobbits, Orlando Bloom's there, and I think Andy Serkis, and Bernard Hill is supposed to be part of that too. So I have no doubt the session has become kind of a bit of an impromptu memorial, and maybe there'll be video that'll surface or things like that. And I'm certainly looking forward to reactions. But Hill is just a good, solid actor. It was one of those things like looking over everything as I was reading the news, I was reminded almost of roles he was good at that had almost slipped my mind because he had done so many of them. Drowning by Numbers was an excellent example. If you're not familiar with the work of Peter Greenaway, that is a very good entry point, and he does spectacularly in it. I had almost forgotten he was in Paranorman, that wonderful animated film about a decade back.
I didn't know he was in Paranorman.
Yeah, he plays the judge in Paranorman. So voice role, acting role in that one. Lovely job. As with any actor, sometimes picking jobs is sort of like he did that. Like I vaguely remember post Lord of the Rings, his biggest high profile thing in terms of Hollywood filmmaking was that Halle Berry, sort of psychological horror film Gothica, if you remember that, around the mid 2000s.
He was in
Gothica with a K. It was, and it was sort of like, it's one of these type of films. It's sort of like, I mentally group that film with things like The Number 23 with Jim Carrey and things like this, one of those sort of weird mid 2000s-y, what are these type films? Things like that. But
that was a moment.
It is a moment for sure. But Hill, we talked about, I think, Oriana, I thought your comments, especially on his work in our episodes on the films, kind of were the best, especially how he worked with Miranda Otto. That was such a good way that they played out over those two films, their relationship. You really got a sense of depth from both of them, and they just knew exactly how to make it work. It was really, really grounded, indeed, in the best way. The other thing I think I will add is, beyond that, is, switching back to the movies getting a screening. Nice.
Sure.
Not the end of the world here. So it's one of those things that Alamo has been doing in screenings like this for years and years now, and I was actually able to catch them back in January when they do that. They always seem to do it in January, and it was nice to be able to see those, and they were not the remastered versions. So they were the extended but not remastered. So this is how to see them. And so the news that they're coming back this way, it's like, oh no.
Why? I know we've gone over this so many times, but why does the remastered
tinkering?
They're so terrible.
Just everyone wants to keep tinkering with their stuff forever, and I think this is why I prefer to work in media where you can't tinker forever. Like journalism, there is that Twitter account that tracks changes in New York Times headlines and stories. But, theoretically, you're not really allowed to tinker with stuff after it's done. And I think that's good.
Yeah. But no, in this case, it's like, Walt Whitman
it's not healthy.
No, Walt Whitman had Leaves of Grass right the first time. So sorry, Dead Walt. Yeah. I know it's been almost two centuries, but just sort of like, let things be as they are in the moment for as they were done. So it's one of those things. But anyway, so yes, we will see if we do finally get some trailery or advanced stuff on Werther here and there. It really seems like it would be. I mean, why else would they be doing the screening? This really feels like a way to sort of gin up stuff, because I remember they did that. They did screenings of the three movies when they were building up The Hobbit, when the build up to that first one was coming out. So that's what this makes me most think of. So I'm guessing we'll get something. So we will see what happens. So, but with that said, it is time to move on to the main topic, a very interesting one that Jared has chosen. So why don't we just go into that? Jared, the floor is yours.
Once upon a time, there was a little bunny. He met another little bunny, and they agreed to get married, but then he was called away to fight in a war. Against another warren of bunnies, I guess. Expansionist bunnies. While fighting in the bunny war, he got very interested in painting, and he started planning a big and fabulous bunny painting, and all his bunny friends were killed in the war. But he kept working on that painting. He made sketch after sketch. Sometimes he even got around to painting, but then he would get everything blocked in and realize he made a fundamental mistake in composition, or he preferred other colors, so he would go back to the sketches. When the bunny war was over, he married his bunny sweetheart and got a job at Bunny College teaching art history. Bunny art history. And he kept working on that painting. Eventually, he sold a little doodle that, though very small and cute, had some figures in its background that were taken from the latest idea for that big painting. And people wanted more of his art. But not that big painting, because it was too confusing and Celtic. Though it wasn't actually Celtic, it was bunny. So he took a little figure from that little doodle and made it into a larger painting. And that larger painting kept growing till finally he felt like it was finished. And in the background of that painting were figures from that huge unfinished painting. And he thought they were the point of all his work, while everyone focused on the foreground. Also, during all of this, he was a very important professor of bunny art history and wrote influential essays about other bunny paintings, and he had some kids. But mostly everyone liked his two big paintings, talked about those, and asked him lots of questions about them and stuff like that. He learned a lot about himself and his art this way, but he got kind of grouchy too, so the lesson here is not to bother your faves. Eventually, he died, and his bunny son took all of his unfinished sketches and collaged them into some sort of complete image, and then kept finding more and more sketches on letters and bills and receipts from bunny grocery stores, so for a while we had a new one every year, and it got a little old for some people. Have you guessed who that bunny was, children? That's right, it was J.R.R. Tolkien! Also, the bunny hated Allegory! So, not to get all Webster's dictionary, but what is allegory? I think we all know, but for sake of journalistic integrity, an allegory is a piece of art, whether verbal, literary, visual, where its elements very intentionally stand for something else. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a famous example where Aslan is Jesus and the witch is Satan, and Turkish Delight is the hollow pleasure of sinning. Again, I don't know. What? And Father Christmas is Father Christmas. They're not all winners. They're not all winners.
There are limitations to this approach. There are limitations.
You also find it in paintings. I kind of hate allegorical paintings. There's a lot of them in the Renaissance and Baroque periods, like Vermeer's Allegory of Painting, which is a painting about painting, and it's not his best work, in my opinion. But anyway, intentionally is the key word here when you're talking about allegory. Tolkien famously said in his introduction to the second edition of Lord of the Rings that he, quote, cordially detested allegory in all its forms, unquote. He said this particularly in response to people claiming the ring represented atomic weapons or whatever, and went on to outline how he would have written Lord of the Rings if it was meant as an allegory, with the hobbits ending up slaves or not surviving or whatever. He also said he preferred applicability, a word that he does not quite elaborate on, but which I think is key to how he thought about literature as a whole. But let's finish with allegory first, because this episode is about allegory and applicability, but mostly allegory, I guess. Or not. We'll find out. In that introduction to Lord of the Rings, he refers to allegory and its, quote, purposed domination by the author, end quote. In other words, the author is telling you what you should be taking away from the work. And he hated that. And putting all my cards on the table, I agree. I way prefer stuff where the author lets me make up my own mind about things. I feel like I learn more about the world the real world, about the book, about the author, even about myself that way. I will say it is allegory is sort of forgivable in those like old philosophical dialogues where a character named like virtue or whatever is there to speak on behalf of virtue. But in fiction, like where a lion is explicitly Jesus, to name a completely random and probably fake example, it kind of doesn't tell you anything except, as Ned said, X equals X. Like there's no wiggle room. But to be fair, if I must, to allegory, I will say it can be revealing. Having a character who is explicitly philosophy or virtue or whatever can tell you a lot about how philosophy or virtue is understood by that author in that time, in that place, which is a boon for historians. But still, for me, as a reader, falls a little flat, because when you load something with that much explicit meaning, everything in it is kind of squashed into two dimensions. It's still didactic in the literal sense of the word, as well as the a lecture sense of the word. Now, applicability. Tolkien was very concerned about how literature transforms the world for us. We got into this in our On Fairy Stories episode, but he often thought about literature in terms of like redefinition or refreshment, maybe is a better word. Like by seeing something given importance in a story, like symbolic importance, or just observed in a different way, you can come to a new understanding of that thing. He didn't want to write Lord of the Rings as a World War II or World War I allegory, because that gives less imaginative space to the reader. But treating Middle-earth as a world with its own internal logic allows the reader much more space. With allegory, the characters and locations and events are in service of the meaning. Like if Sauron equals Hitler or Sauron equals the devil, then the reader is left with like one layer of discovery. But if Sauron is a dark lord with his own particular obsessions and traits, you're more free to examine how those traits are villainous in this context, or in our own context, like industrialization. What is that? You're given more questions to play with, rather than playing a match game of like, well, if Sauron is Hitler, then the mouth of Sauron is Goebbels, and Shelob is, it goes on and on. I don't know who Shelob is in this analogy. With literature written for applicability, meaning arises more naturally. You're given the sandbox and the toys, but you can kind of dig the holes and make your own mountains and have your trucks get married and all of that. Allegory kind of just gives you a pre-built space, like, right? That's its point. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about meaning in literature, but I'm a little embarrassed to still be talking after the bunny thing, so it's up to you guys for a bit. I'm just going to read a quick section from letter 109, because I think it instantly complicates the allegory versus applicability thing in extremely Tolkienian ways, not least because he sort of seems to be arguing with himself. This letter is one that he sent to Stanley Unwin after Rayner Unwin read Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien says, do not let Rayner suspect allegory with a capital A. There is a, quote, moral, unquote, I suppose, in any tale worth telling, but that is not the same thing. Even the struggle between darkness and light, as he calls it, not me, is for me, he being Rayner, is for me just a particular phase of history, one example of its pattern perhaps, but not the pattern. And the actors are individuals. They each, of course, contain universals, or they would not live at all, but they never represent them as such. Of course, allegory and story, both capitalized, converge, meeting somewhere in truth, capitalized, so that the only perfectly consistent allegory is real life, and the only fully intelligible story is an allegory. And one finds even in imperfect human literature that the better and more consistent an allegory is, the more easily can it be read just as a story, and the better and more closely woven a story is, the more easily can those so minded find allegory in it. But the two start out from opposite ends. You can make The Ring into an allegory of our own time, if you like, an allegory of the inevitable fate that waits for all attempts to defeat evil power by power, but that is only because all power, magical or mechanical, does always so work. You cannot write a story about an apparently simple magic ring without that bursting in, if you really take the ring seriously and make things happen that would happen if such a thing existed. So, since you were taking notes during that portion, I'm sure, what does the only fully intelligible story as an allegory mean, and how does that feed into him hating allegory? Or does it? Go! Break!
Oriana, you want to start first?
No, Ned, you can start us off on this one.
Okay, all right. Well, you see, the thing that leapt out to me is that seems to be, your point about it being very Tolkienian, is that he seems to be wrestling with the idea, I'm going to try and summarize this, because it was sort of bouncing around the idea as you were reading it. It's weirdly his attempt to try and argue for a kind of realism. Note I say a kind, because it sounds like what he's trying to do is sort of like, if truth and these So reality is sort of like the idea that real life is important. All of a sudden, it's sort of like, realism suddenly has a particular role to play in seemingly fantastic literature from where Tolkien's coming from, because there seems to be sort of an idea that the more true something is, the more one can react to, like, okay, this is how real people would act or react in certain situations, then that would be something that, what is being told will resonate more. And in its resonance, truth can be found without necessarily making it quote-unquote allegorical. Tie into that, for instance, if you will, his particular interest in getting details, not merely of geography, right, but of calendar, obsessing over getting where the phases of the moon would be, things like that. In other words, it's sort of the idea that he's not creating sort of as he's always said, Middle-earth is not some sort of unknown, unique, strange, otherworldly landscape. It's our Earth. If it is our Earth, it needs to be recognizable as such. We can place ourselves in it, and that's how we can react to it. Therefore, the reactions of characters within that make a certain kind of sense. Okay, we're here in this world and we are humans and other creatures who have seemingly recognizable human-like qualities that we can interact with them. So that's kind of like, that's a bit nuts and boltsy maybe as opposed to the wider question, but I think it's illustrative, and it's interesting that Tolkien would, oddly enough, even as he says he dislikes allegory, is almost sort of saying that the act of something fictive, the act of creating a story itself, the story is the allegory as opposed to an allegorical story, and that's a very, very fine distinction. I realize I may be sort of trying to make a very, very light division there, but I sense that what he might be indicating with that comment. That's kind of my initial read, at least. Oriana?
Yes. I'm like kind of avoiding the question. Like, I'm going to go on like a weird tangent or something that feels to me kind of like a tangent. So it's kind of interesting to me that Tolkien is sort of considered one of the modernist, right? Like,
Shippey makes that argument a lot.
Yeah, he does. Yeah,
and yet he has so many elements of both his personality and his writing that feel very postmodern in a lot of ways. I think we've probably talked about this at some point, and I'm just not remembering. But I feel like that kind of ties into this idea of, of having this attitude as allegory is kind of what you bring to it, what you bring to his work, even as like it is theoretically supposed to be what the author is telling you, and yet the human mind finds ways to bring its own allegory, even to things that are otherwise very strictly prescribed to be other allegorical things. So I love this idea of allegory and story converging on truth at this point. It's almost like a spectrum where truth lies in the middle of these two poles.
There's a sort of like, I think what he's getting at is this kind of interpenetration of symbol and the real world, and fantasy or fairy stories, as you might call them, sit really comfortably in the middle of that, like that Venn diagram, where it's like the impulse to read something that when you read something that is fantastical, the impulse is to read it as meaning something, whereas I don't think there's the same impulse necessarily with extremely realist fiction. It definitely depends on the reader. I know people who get really into realist fiction in the same way that I get really into fantastical fiction. But yeah, like he's talking about things like universals being like they have to be present, kind of in order for the story to work, and universals kind of pull you down the path of allegory if you're not careful. But he doesn't want to go down that way. And I also think the fact that he's talking to Stanley Unwin about this does complicate matters a little bit, because what you say to your publisher is not what you say to your friends.
You raise that raises also a question. Something I was thinking about as we started talking about this is also placing this particular letter and the time frame in general, not merely a question of modernism, but also some of the work that was being done by people around that time, where it was specifically allegorical in a particular way. A good example of something, more or less, I forget the exact time frame it was when it was written, but would have been around that time, was George Orwell's Animal Farm. which is almost pure allegory, and that is meant to be a fictive description of real people and real events, all set in terms of a depiction of something on an animal farm. And if you haven't read it, read it. It's good. It is something where even without all the details, the historical context, you don't need to know about Trotsky and Stalin and their falling out to enjoy the book for what it is, but it is in that context exactly what is going on, and that was absolutely Orwell's intent from it. Arguably, though, at the same time, it is a case, as Oriana pointed out, where if you don't come in knowing that, and you're looking at it in terms of, how do power dynamics and corruption and people twisting things work? It works on that level too. So it is simultaneously of its time. It was meant to be like, hey, it's this, and now it's more like, well, it could be a number of different things, can't it? And in the end, it's always another elite rises and takes control. So, for instance,
in the introduction to Lord of the Rings that I was quoting from, he talks about preferring, right after talking about hitting allegory, he talks about preferring history, real or feigned, and Middle Earth is very much a feigned history. And the Orwell comparison is very interesting, and you bring that up. I had forgotten about that. I did not like Animal Farm when I read it, precisely because it was so allegorical and so like one-to-one kind of things going on that I was like, well, I don't care. Okay. Because it doesn't feel like anything is going on except the author playing a game with like putting masks on things.
Dress up.
Okay,
yeah.
Right,
Dress
right,
up, yeah.
Right.
Whereas 1984, which is not really allegorical, although it has resonances with real world stuff.
Right.
I found incredibly engaging because it is kind of like a feigned history in a way. There's all of this stuff, all of this thought put into how this functions. It's not the real world, but you can see how it could be. It really, really, really got to me in a way that Animal Farm absolutely didn't. So
ditto like Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. Which I only read it like in 2018, 2019 and was like, oh my God.
Surprise.
But that is very, it's sort of like US 1984 in a sense, and in ways that resonate way too deeply. I think it was like 80 years after it had been written, because it is a feigned history. Like that I feel like that's kind of the key to longevity and to versus this sort of allegory, which yes, we bring our own stuff to it if we don't know the context exactly, but it's probably not gonna resonate as much. We read Animal Farm in like 8th grade and I was like, this is tired.
Yeah. I think what makes allegory not work for me, and I feel like maybe for him, is the way that it is a meaning first approach, which means that when you're doing this kind of, like if you're telling a parable, like the prodigal son or whatever, it's short. You don't really have to get into it very much. It's just like this thing happens and it tells you a lesson, and that's fine. But when you expand that out into a full-length narrative and you're still trying to have things mean a specific thing, you end up fighting against telling a good story, because you're like, well, especially if you're using an allegory where something represents a very specific real-world thing, but you're using something else to do that. I mean, obviously because it's a symbol, but like in Narnia, where you've got like Lion Jesus and all that, it doesn't, for me, obviously a ton of people don't feel the same, or it wouldn't be as popular as it is. When you have like Lion Jesus, like that doesn't really work as well as it should, in my opinion, because you're making Jesus a giant predator.
He was the Lamb of God. For Christ's sake.
Consistently the Lamb of God, like a carpenter, a humble kind of thing. He rode
a donkey.
Yeah, Lewis had a very different idea of Jesus even from the Bible. So having this metaphor be this means that the allegory itself is kind of falling apart after a certain point, because you keep having to overcome this idea that you're standing right next to a lion, and trying to tell a story with that. you overextend it. It kind of works in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe because he's only there for like a few chapters. Mm-hmm. But as it goes on and the books keep going and he keeps trying to do sort of allegorical things with them, although less so after the first one, it starts really, really, really falling apart because you cannot have a lion deity and say meaningful things about Christianity. In my opinion, with other allegories that go on for a long time, Animal Farm is a very short book, but for me, it's too long.
Fair.
It does start to fall because you start getting, or I start getting really interested in how this actually functions as like a society with pigs and horses, and what do the different animals what does it mean to be a chicken in this context, or whatever? And it doesn't really get into that because it's about Trotsky and Stalin, and so
right.
That's why it doesn't really work for me.
Maybe something in terms of a further, I don't say comparison point, but we're in my case, I'm doing limiting here to English literature in particular, is that which, and obviously Tolkien knew much more than that, is that Tolkien, knowing exactly his full range of what he was educated on in terms of reading when he grew up, and also what he paid attention to as he got further as academic career, this would be helpful. But I am guessing that he had, as much as I'm sure many other students did, I'm thinking back to admittedly my later education in terms of English lit myself, which is some decades removed in a country, is that you learn things about, for instance, a whole lot of, in particular, Protestant English literature that's very allegorical.
Like Pilgrim's Progress.
That was exactly the first example I was going to bring up. Pilgrim's Progress is one of them. Another one would be Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, both of which are, explicitly allegorical and also very explicitly Protestant. Which was, what Tolkien would probably get his hives up even more. So there's that. Paradise Lost is its own thing because it is meant to be a biblical retelling. You can't exactly have that be allegory when you're actually talking about the figures from the Bible.
Actual Satan. It's actual Satan.
So slightly different vibes. But Bunyan and Spenser and many other things too. I can see that being the type of thing that is where Tolkien's waspish reaction in that thing, talking about things when he were worried about allegory, talking about when he senses he's really getting to the point where he knows it's coming. It's like, here it is, and all that. I can see that growing out of an early disdain for that, or an early sort of, oh my God, and all that, which makes it interesting that in ways what he's doing is he is definitely responding so much literature that is explicitly or at least seemingly removed from a particular Christian context throughout his life. The Kalevala is a good example. He knew his Homer. He knew Beowulf, whatever slathering on top of it, as we talked about. It's at heart is still a pagan story to one degree or another. In other words, it's the type of thing that he could bring his own viewpoint into it, and he's the one who said that he considered Lord of the Rings a Christian and Catholic work. And, he's very clear about what it means in terms of his feeling of it, but he's not making it be, dare I say, an allegory for his particular belief, even though he views it intrinsically from his own stated point of view. So, and I think there's something, the idea is sort of like, look, if I can, in my brain, he's like, if I can synthesize from these sources and pull together my thing without having to create this cloying mess that people like Bunyan or Spencer or whatever did and all that, then I can maybe, quote unquote, do it right, is maybe what he's thinking to some degree. I'm putting words in his mouth. I don't ever see him claiming that, but this could be part of his sort of like subconscious thinking about it. I'm not positive, but
his biggest objection that he brings up in that introduction is the domination by the author aspect. Like, he doesn't want them to tell him what to think about the story. I will say there is such an interesting tension for me between him being like, I don't want the author to dom me while I'm reading this book. But he's also, if you read the letters, whenever people misinterpreted his work, he was like, oh my God, I got to shut that shit down immediately. Yeah. Which is so funny. And maybe that's maybe a dead end for discussion. I don't know. But I think it is hilarious that he was like, I don't want people to feel like I'm telling them what to think about this, but also this is what you should think about it.
I think this is the frustration of middle managers everywhere, I want to say, because in a way, I think he did kind of view himself not as a middle manager because no, but that was kind of his function as a sub-creator.
Yes.
Is he like to think, you're like, yes, all of my creativity comes from God. This is just a reflection of his divinity, etc. But also, like, you're looking at the reflection wrong.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of that position is quite similar to that of a lot of people in middle management.
I think it's interesting.
To make an allegory of my own.
There you go. I think it's interesting that he comes up with that statement in the introduction to the revised edition, which is already, at that point, he would have been 10 years into responding to these questions and in many cases telling them when they're wrong. So it's sort of like,
I'm sure.
Yeah, it's like, is he being a hypocrite, or is he just simply sort of seeing as like, maybe he's trying to take the measure of it being sort of like, who can say? I mean, it's just an interesting question. We don't have drafts or his thought about that introduction. It is arguably one of the key pieces that he wrote over time, where, as far as I can recall, maybe there's something in the history of Middle-earth books, I'm not sure, where we have any sort of sense of drafts or what it was going into it or why he wrote or what he was trying to say. It seems to be just sort of imminent. It's sort of like it's a fairly short piece. It's only like a page or two long, and we sort of treat it as it is. But clearly it's something that weighed on his mind. Otherwise it would have been included in such a short thing. He wouldn't have thought to bring it up if he didn't think it was so vitally important. So here's something to complicate it further, is to throw it in that we do know, in fact, we've talked about an incredibly allegorical work of his that he did do, and that's Leaf by Niggle.
I was going to bring that up for sure. Yeah.
So let's plunge right into that. I mean, so the context again of Leaf by Niggle, again, we'll link to the episode where he talked about that. It is published originally as part of the Tree and Leaf combination with On Fairy Stories, and has been since anthologized and appears in different contexts, but and on its own too. But again, the importance of Leaf by Niggle is, one, it is published in an explicitly Catholic journal, the Dublin Review, so it was something that was in a particular set audience for that, and two, is indeed a huge allegory, specifically of Catholic belief about faith versus works, if you will, and all that, but the idea of also what happens to you after you die, purgatory, eventually achieving paradise, working out your sins, if you will, keeping your eye on what needs to be done, even though the real world has its own callings. There's so much into it. It's so much of a thing, and it's as much allegorical for, I'm sure, Tolkien's view in his own life. I just want to write my story, and yet the world keeps asking me to do things, as well as clearly his own deep Catholic belief on how this plays out, given Catholic theology. It's all right there. I mean, it is nothing but a huge allegory. So it's almost like, did he allow himself this space for it, or what do we think?
No, he did not, actually. So I was looking at a lot of the letters for this, because obviously he doesn't talk a ton about it in other places.
Right.
And in letter 241, he's talking about Leaf by Niggle, and he specifically says, it is not really or properly an allegory so much as mythical, for Niggle is meant to be a real mixed quality person and not an allegory of any single vice or virtue. I feel like that is a dodge. That is totally a cop-out.
Yes.
You can have an allegory for the everyday man. Like, that's fine. That's
a total dodge. That's like the most hair splitting. Which is not terribly surprising, but like...
Right. Like, you have to define allegory extremely specifically, as it's only everybody in it is representing a vice or a virtue or a whatever, and not... Like, come on. You can't redefine something just so that you get to participate in it.
I wonder if it's how he consciously just sort of thought of it as something, trying to be separate from what he, quote unquote, really did, which, again, we have to remember, Tolkien was not a, quote unquote, professional author. He did not write stories for a living. He was an academic for a living who pursued various things and interests over the course of his life, a couple of which happen to be very well-known books, as we all know. So it may be one of those things that he saw it as sort of separate from what he was doing. It would be interesting if, in another world, if that was a story that if it was presented to him that he hadn't written, and it was written like that, would he have enjoyed it or would he have not? And there's no way for him. Obviously, this couldn't be done. It's like, that's a pure thought exercise. But, for instance, there could be the question, did he see similar allegories in maybe specifically Catholic journals, contexts, etc., things like this? Was he tired of them, and did he think to himself, I can do a better allegory and this is mine? That could have been something subconsciously what's going on there, too, to use that word again. But it's an interesting question. It sticks out like the sore thumb it is, compared to everything else that he's done, where you can say that something like, I don't know, Smith and Wooten Major is arguably to some degree about, like, aging and creativity and how that goes, but it's not really an allegory. It's more thematic.
Yeah, that's theme.
Yeah, that's theme, as opposed to X equals X. So, whereas clearly in Leave by Niggle, so...
Yeah, I would have accepted this dodge more readily if he had been like, that's just, hey, I'm just a little guy or a little parable.
I'm a little birthday boy.
It's my birthday.
Yeah.
I wrote a parable.
Great.
If
I'm thinking about Tolkien going, I am a small bean, and it is not helping me.
Hey, it's my birthday.
Tolkien. What's interesting about Leaf by Niggle specifically is that when he talks about writing it, he talks about basically, you said subconscious, it like he dreamed it or something and then woke up, wrote it down, and the final version that was published was apparently not that different from what he originally envisioned. So this clearly came out very easily from somewhere in his brain, whereas he had to struggle to produce Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and what became the Silmarillion. So it was in there. It was ready to come out. There's also, I feel like, and I didn't do a ton of research on this part, but I feel like there's a ton of intersections here between what he thinks is the difference between allegory and myth.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Like, what is up with that? I don't know if I have any answers for you right now, because I know he talks about things like fairy stories or whatever being kind of like a reflection of the one true myth, which is Christianity. Maybe he's a little more eloquent and elaborate talking about it than that.
Well.
But that myth is serving its own function that is not the same as allegory. And so if he's thinking Leaf by Niggle is mythical, then okay, but it's still like, come on.
That also just feels like, when I think mythical, I think like a purpose that's very different from just regular allegory, which is like to bring together or build culture.
Okay.
Rather than just a little story about a guy who can't finish things. Like, I don't know, mythical. Well, that's just come on.
It depends on how you talk about myth, right? Like a myth could certainly be a little guy who never finishes anything. But I still feel like Leaf by Niggle is an allegory. Yeah. I'm just saying the more I talk about it, the more I'm like, well, I can see how he thought it was mythical in some way. But still. But still.
I think what's interesting about it, though, and this may be also part of his mental classifying, how he can call it not allegory, is that even though, what you can have how characters can react to allegorical figures, arguably it's the setting that's allegorical rather than the people. In the By Niggle. At most you have, the voices, I forget what they're called, the authorities, something like that.
I think they're just the voices.
Yeah. It was sort of like, okay, because like angelic powers, seems like, that's pretty much all we get. We don't get the big guy or his second command at all, and things like this. Instead, we're going through landscapes, we're going through locations, and that, of course, again, think Pilgrim's Progress, there's something there, and all that. So the fact that we're not sort of directly encountering, incarnations of, to borrow terms here, we're not. This is not consolation of philosophy. Niggle is not getting someone coming in to his room and I going, "Hi, I'm X." I'm creativity or whatever. So it's a different sort of thing. So again, I don't think he's trying to split hairs completely on that much, but I can see him trying to sort of like use the question of, how to put it, psychic landscapes, or, psychogeography, however you want to describe it. Sort of like, okay, what if we did this type of thing? And I can see him being vaguely more interested in that, because, he loves describing places in Niggle, the workhouse, and then what eventually becomes Niggle's parish, and so forth, and things like that. Even for a short story, it's sort of like, oh, these are vivid descriptions. So as much as he loved the equivalent of similarly vivid descriptions in another short work, Smith and Wooten Major, et cetera, et cetera. So, he loves his landscapes. Maybe the landscapes allow him sort of like, maybe location allows him to sort of play around with that one, where, again, in Middle-earth, we don't have that. We have terrible places and great places, but they're not allegorical landscapes. If anything, they're like transformed landscapes or symbolism on a wider level of art amard, which is more like, hey, that's your mythic corruption of everything to begin with, and where it went from there.
Yeah, this is not to the point at all, but while you were talking, I did have a terrible vision of the X-rated Consolations of Philosophy.
Oh, man.
By Boethius.
Yes, when the porn industry runs out of the modern movie knockoffs things to do and all that, they'll start
Look,
going
I will
to the
become a
public domain.
porn mogul just to make that.
We're broad-minded here on By-The-Bywater.
Anyway,
younger listeners, yeah. So, moving on.
Ask your parents, kids.
Who in the world? Well, moving beyond that, maybe a couple other things throughout. I mean, we've already invoked Lewis. The cartoon that we all know by now, it's been going around for a few years. I've got the exact origin, the one where it's supposed to be the difference between Tolkien and Lewis, where someone comes up to Tolkien saying, "Is it true that?" And Tolkien's like, "No, never. If you bring this up again, I will call the police." And then it cuts to Lewis going like, "How can I make sure people absolutely understand that Aslan is Jesus?"
Yeah.
And it's a stereotype, but it is also incredibly true. And it's just one of those things that it's interesting to me that that in many ways we have a case where two works where, again, its creators were very clear in their minds about it being Christian, one being very explicitly so, the other one saying, hey, I consider this a Catholic work, Tolkien, of course, is that we have a case where it's interesting that Lord of the Rings is so relatively easily adaptable and understandable, whereas attempts to do that with Narnia, usually after the first book, fall apart. In one way or another. It's sort of like you can do glorious one-offs, if you will. But then once people start getting deeper into the series, it's like everything starts to sort of like run aground in terms of adaptations by the third or fourth book. The BBC live-action series did that. The movie series in the 2000s, well, we know what happened there. And
it's coming back, though.
But now Greta Gerwig's going to give it the old college try.
And I'm very intrigued to see what especially if she co-writes it with Baumbach, what the hell is going to happen?
What is that? What a fascinating career choice.
It is. Yeah.
I'm not saying it's bad. It's just very interesting to me.
And we know she could do adaptation, Little Women. So it's sort of like things could happen very interestingly here. So yeah, but there is something there is this interesting tension about how we know Tolkien did not like Narnia. He's very clear about that for the reasons he described. If anything, it seems like the message in the introduction is almost like his chance to get in the final word on the subject, and it would be the final word because at that point Lewis had been dead for 2 years, so it's sort of like you can't bite back.
Kicking him when he's down.
I know.
Right. Well, what's funny, so I do have the collected letters of C.S. Lewis because in my years as a conservative Christian teen, I was extremely Lewis-pilled.
Well,
and it still has a ton of post-it notes in it. I don't even know what I was marking up here, but anyway, I did look at it because I was curious to see if he had anything to say about any of this.
Yeah.
And I did. There is a letter from 1956 that starts, Tolkien's book is not an allegory. A form he dislikes. You'll get nearer to his mind on such subjects by studying his essay on fairy tales, which we did. His root idea of narrative art is subcreation, the making of a secondary world. What you would call a pleasant story for the children would be to him more serious than an allegory, which I think it's funny that like the year after Return of the King comes out, C.S. Lewis is already like, guys, it's not an allegory.
Yes.
He does also, and I think this kind of feeds back into what Tolkien is talking about with Leaf by Niggle and allegory and myth and stuff like that, is that Lewis says, and I doubt he's speaking for Tolkien, but I feel like it resonates with how I read Tolkien. He says that a good myth, i.e. a story out of which ever-varying meanings will grow for different readers in different ages, is a higher thing than an allegory into which one meaning has been put. Into an allegory, a man can put only what he already knows. In a myth, he puts what he does not yet know and could not come to know in any other way. Which, to me, kind of feels like what Tolkien is getting at by saying Leaf by Niggle isn't mythical. And it seems like what he's getting at, what Tolkien is getting at when he talks about myth in general, is that you can only learn these lessons, get this meaning from something that is not telling you what it means in the way that allegory does.
Right. And maybe, keeping it on the time, maybe we can sort of like shift to this as sort of an ending here. We've talked a lot about allegory, less about applicability as such.
That's right. I did want to spend equal time on that, and it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. But let's wrap up by talking about that. Maybe just to ask you a leading question, Jared. You yourself sort of felt like the term, you had questions about the term. Where do you go with that?
literature written for applicability, like the meaning arises more naturally?
Yeah.
Is that what you were getting at?
Kind of, yeah. But I also think it was sort of like a sense of ironically, we know what allegory is. I guess we know it when we see it. But applicability, however, is the type of thing that it's much less of a universal term. Although we sort of get what Tolkien is meaning at, but then again, is it something more, I don't know, fungible? Is it a sleight of hand, even to a degree, or is it something else?
I think applicability is recognizing something in a story, which sounds extremely basic when I say it like that. But I think the element of almost of the unexpected, to like reading the Iliad, and there's like a moment where this happens and you're like, oh my God, that is so real. Even if it's something like, who is it? I want to say it's like Aphrodite gets wounded and then goes to cry in Zeus's lap or something. And it's like, oh my God, like that recognition of this extremely human element in the divine, which can lead you into asking like, what does that mean? What is it doing here? That kind of thing. What does it mean to have a goddess that can be wounded and cries at her father's knees? And it also, there are things that help with this kind of writing for applicability, things that help ground the story in your experience or in things that you can connect to your own experience, even if you've never seen them. Like, again, in the Iliad, and I don't know why this is the first example that came to mind, but
it's a good one.
Like, I think it is the scene where Hector is chasing somebody, Patroclus, around the walls of Troy. I think it is this scene, and Homer pauses to be like, and then here's the place where the Trojan women do their laundry, and it's there's that recognition of like, I do laundry, which sounds silly, but it's like by recognizing that, you are recognizing the horror of all of these lives that have now been interrupted by this war. And when you read something like Lord of the Rings, the Shire isn't like an allegory for 19th century or pre-industrial England, although it takes a lot from that. But in recognizing the domesticity, the happiness, the kind of idyllic stuff that exists there, without it meaning specifically like we're talking about England before the war, you are able to recognize the fragility of this kind of thing in the real world. And applicability also comes in things like the industrialization of Saruman and Sauron is like, well, this is destroying the natural world and it sucks. And it is explicitly evil in the story. How does that apply to real life? Is it as evil in the real world as it is in the story? We don't know. We got to think about that. I mean, I know for Tolkien, it's it's evil. It's evil. Machine's bad, which, you know, have a conversation about that someday. But
yes.
Yeah, like it's that applicability of these people doing these things, and when he talks about universals, like there are only so many experiences. You know, how do you connect to these things? Do you connect to them? Do you not? How do they connect to things that you have learned already? Just applicability is a very broad word because it has so many functions within the way he works, the way he thinks.
Right. It's interesting the way you're phrasing it that way, because applicability is sort of like, as a sense, it's like, okay, I can apply it to something. It's almost like a conscious act. Whereas some of what you're describing in my brain, if I was trying to sort of like use this, I was actually waiting to see if you would use the word. You didn't. That's why I think I go like, well, this is what I would say it. I would automatically go to the idea of resonance.
Yes.
That would be kind of like my way of taking it, which is not the same thing. So the way I think Tolkien is intending it to be, which is interesting. Obviously, I can't pick his brain, but
I think he would have accepted that word if it had been used.
Okay.
Because the way that he talks about applicability does to me feel like it has a ton of common ground with resonance.
Right. It's sort of like, I don't know, maybe it's a more modern term in that regard.
Yeah, I think it is. I think people weren't really using it until the 90s or something. Like
So it's just a way of sort of repurposing that. So, hey, it means something for something else. Who knew? So
yeah.
Let's see. We still have a little time to go. And Jared, I'll let you have the last word. But Oriana, is there any last little observation or thing you want to throw in? Or
yeah, I feel like finding the universal in the specific has always felt like the key to applicability to me.
That's what I just took like 10 minutes to try to say. God damn it!
That's why all we work together here on this podcast.
Jared's audio editor. Yeah, that's what all lasting art contains is this sense of, and even it even applies to certain allegorical stories that are that work and are good. These
they
very
exist.
specific. Yeah, it's totally. Animal Farm is a very popular book for reasons.
Yeah. Even if I didn't like it, that doesn't mean it doesn't have its
doesn't mean
own...
it's without artistic merit,
I know,
et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I hate a ton of stuff, so it's
hate can be powerful.
Born
Right.
hater, Jared Pekacek.
Right.
Wow, the hateration. But any final last thoughts on the subject, Jared, to wrap up for now?
No, I don't think I could improve on what Oriana just said. So
all right, there it is. Oriana has provided the allegory for Jared's meaning, and we're set. Even though I completely screwed up that definition there too. So, and with that, we're done. Okay, the choice of topic for the next episode has come back around to me, and we're going to do something that we've actually planned this for a little while now, because we realized that it would sync up in the calendar this way. As we've been talking to you now for months, years, a certain new novel is about to come out, which we may have even talked about at the start of this episode, and we'll talk about it again. And that is, of course, Jared's debut novel, The West Passage, is coming out in July. And so for our July episode, we wanted to celebrate that and make sure you, of course, pick up your copies. But more to that, we were thinking about what's a way to talk about it without just simply being promo like, hey, wonderful novel, and all that, and tie into the theme of what we're talking about here. And my idea for this is to basically use the publication of the novel and ask Jared questions on this, but to expand out further to the idea of, and this is the way I'm phrasing it, resisting Tolkien. Now, not hating Tolkien. This is not about Edmund Wilson going yeah or anything like that. Rather, what I would like to cast the wide net, how over the decades since Tolkien landed with a big bomb, thanks to Lord of the Rings, how it has not merely shaped the impact of fantasy literature there, but what do you do when thinking about the many authors on down who are looking at Tolkien and thinking that's an remarkable achievement, and I don't want to do that. However, it's broadly defined, and there are many different authors looking at this in many different ways. In ways, think about this episode as being the flip side to the Terry Brooks episode, where someone really wanted to be Tolkien and failed. Now we're going to look at people who, even if their novels are not necessarily universally successful over people, and that's why I want to cast a broad net. I have a number of names in mind. I'm sure other people come up with theirs as well, who are basically trying not to tell Lord of the Rings over again, or not to simply do the same thematic approach, or not to simply have it be the idea that this is what fantasy is all in itself. So no, there are other stories to tell. How are we telling them? What is this? Is it a matter of less resisting Tolkien than, say, resisting Tolkien's effects, if you will, have something built in? They're casting this widely. So again, I don't want to get into the full episode. We'll wait until we record it. But that is the idea of what to bring up, and will also be a way for us to celebrate the publication of Jared's novel at the same time, rightly. So hooray for that. So
this is my Oprah interview.
Yay!
Oprah's book club.
Right.
And then you end up on the thing, and then she tosses out copies, and you get a copy, and you get a copy. It could happen.
Beaning people left and right with a hardcover.
Bang.
350-page hardcover fantasy novel right to the noggin.
That's how you know it'll make a mark, literally. So we win. Okay. All right. So let's wrap up here. So again, we will be coming back to you in a month's time with that, and take it from there. In the meantime, gosh, we've gotten through half the year already with these episodes. Where did this year go? So it was like all of a sudden we're just wrapped up and done. Insane. We'll have stories, we'll have things to tell, we'll have stuff to talk about next time. But in the meantime, thank you again very much for listening. As always, greatly appreciated. We hope you're enjoying the new homepage at megaphonic.fm/By-The-Bywater. Let us know if you have any feedback or questions. Of course, By-The-Bywater is on Blue Sky, and we are all there individually as well as many other social media spots. Check us out. Links in the show notes, etc. Things like that as well. And of course, you can always write us at any time at bythebywater@gmail.com. Thanks again very much for listening. We absolutely appreciate it. We will come back to you next time. Until then.